Hi, good afternoon. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited to close out the conference here today. So I'm going to be talking about the red pill of resilience. This is not the Reddit red pill. This is the Matrix red pill, so don't get any wrong ideas. And resilience is a topic extremely important to me, so I hope I can convince you that it's important too. So first, I'm Kelly Shortridge. I'm a product manager at SecurityScorecard. I used to do investment banking. I started a security startup. But what I really like to do kind of on my nights and weekends is research the intersections of behavioral economics with InfoSec, as well as look at applications across different domains to information security. So I think there's a big problem in InfoSec right now, and it's existed for a long time, probably like a lot of you guys have been in the industry, maybe for 10 years, you've seen this happen. There's an obsession with stopping or the more creative thwarting that I don't think is particularly healthy. So I think as well, there's been an insufficient exploration of what it means to be resilient. And I think most poetically stated, this is by Robert Jordan, referencing one of Aesop's fables. The oak fought the wind and was broken. The willow bent when it must and survived. So I think to speak of stopping or thwarting anything without thinking about resilience doesn't make any sense. So prevention and deterrence can serve as really valuable tactics. I think we all can agree on that, but it's not the only thing. It can grant some level of peace, but it doesn't guarantee that you'll continue to survive the war, so to speak. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek of China poetically put it as, the more you sweat in peace, the less you bleed in war. The idea is you can attempt the peace through prevention, but you need to be able to survive the war through resilience. The discourse in InfoSec, I think, has mostly kept resilience at a buzzword level, particularly thinking about cyber insurance. They talk a lot about resilience. I don't think we've had a proper exploration of what that actually means and really thinking about what it's meant in other contexts to date. So I think resilience has this kind of torrential conceptual power, and I'm hoping to explore it here today. So resilience is ultimately about accepting reality. This is the nature of kind of the war we're in, and it's also making sure to build your defensive strategy around that reality. First, I'm going to talk about why it's time to talk about resilience and why I think it's time to have a paradigm shift, and I really don't use that term lightly. And also how our collective grief led us to this point. So I really think that we've been going through the stages of grief in our industry. Next, I'll share the etymology of resilience. InfoSec is one of the newest applications. There have been a ton of others in different domains, including those with complex systems. So I'm going to explore those. Then finally, I'm going to really hone in on the three key characteristics of resilience, which are robustness, adaptability, and transformability. So really thinking about how you can withstand attacks, how you can reduce any sort of losses incurred, then finally, like how you can challenge your assumptions going forward. The stages of grief. I'm assuming most of you all are familiar with them, but I'm going to recap and then show you how they apply to InfoSec. So I think the reason why we're talking about resilience is we're entering the final stage of grief, which is acceptance. Basically, the kind of thing that we're grieving is the fact that there will never be such a thing as an unhackable organization or system. So over the past 20 years, I think we've been grieving this fact that companies will never be able to stop all attacks. They'll never be invulnerable to attack. Very little can be done against the latest exploit, latest attack vector, and most of the time we have plenty of unknown methods and unknown actors against whom we have to wrestle. Like most grief, it isn't a linear process. I think we've had fits and starts, but I'm hoping that we can finally get to kind of this final acceptance stage. So first, it's denial, which is clinging to a false sense of reality. I think it manifested as back in the 90s, companies thinking security is not that important to me, we really aren't at risk, and not actually deploying any solutions. Next is anger, so recognizing the denial can't continue and becoming frustrated that it can't. I think this manifested in some of the harsh penalties and legislation that we saw kind of late 90s, early 2000s, prosecuting and punishing vulnerability researchers, even those that are giving away their research freely or disclosing responsibly. So basically, it's your fault that I need security. The third stage is bargaining, so it's hope that you can actually avoid the cause of your grief. I think this resulted in the explosion that we currently have of all the new tools, tons of fragmented solutions, because maybe we can stop attacks from happening at all. The fourth stage is depression. Colin actually mentioned security nihilism, and I think this is part of it. So it's despair at the recognition of your predicament. So I think it was kind of the refrain of like, everyone's gonna get hacked. Why does it really matter? It doesn't matter what we do. Like, as long as we're meeting compliance, who cares? But the final stage is acceptance, and that's embracing the inevitability, the new reality. So it's understanding that there is inevitability of successful attack, but it's also recognition that you have the ability to prepare and not all is hopeless. So attacks will happen, but I can be prepared. I do fear that the bargaining stage has set us up for failure in transitioning to the acceptance phase. Again, as I mentioned, there's been an explosion of security tools, which causes a huge problem and results in what I think is an untenable market for lemons. There have been there's a paper called like No Such Thing as a Silver Bullet in Security. That's a really good paper on kind of this problem. FUD also preys on this desperation to bargain. It's no different than like selling hope of a cure to those who are chronically ill through snake oil. The bargaining stage, in my opinion, is basically the demand for which snake oil is the supply, and it sets us up for failure. But security nihilism also isn't the answer. Again, that's part of the depression phase. I think it's an inaccurate conclusion. There are things you can do, and one of those things is make sure that you're a resilient organization. Because when you think that everything is hopeless, it doesn't incentivize anyone in this industry to pursue smart strategies, right? So I think it's really important we have a conversation about what resilience means, and there are tactics you can do that will actually make a meaningful difference. So the etymology of resilience, and I know we are not in a college lecture, so I will keep this brief. Basically, up until the early 19th century, the primary meaning of resilience was to rebound. It really started out in engineering, and that was in 1858, so it was really to imply strength and ductility, basically the ability for a material to go back to its original shape when it was under some level of stress. What we've seen is that a definition in kind of InfoSec and other realms has been an abstraction from this physical characteristic, so bouncing back to whatever the normal is defined, like a pre-existing stable equilibrium. But in the 20th century, we saw, and particularly starting in the 1950s, an awakening in psychology, where it's actually basically one's ability to adapt to hostile situations and stress over time. Because naturally, if you're exposed to some sort of traumatic event, you can't just bounce back psychologically to the original state. You're not going to be prepared for kind of like, think about PTSD. You have to have different coping strategies. In the 1970s, it started being used in ecology and the social sciences, eventually going into like climate change, basically all the areas where humans are also affected by things that happen scientifically. And you can't just think about it as we're rebounding to the same equilibrium. So it's really thinking about how do you have adaptability in that. Then finally in the 2010s, with climate change, disaster recovery, this idea of evolutionary resilience is really important, which is that systems co-evolve together. And I'll talk about that in a second. So complex systems. What is a complex system? So it's basically when a lot of underlying components interact with each other. It's very difficult to predict behavior because everything's nonlinear. And examples in our daily lives, like our universe, our planet's climate, our cities, our brains, our cells, all of these are complex systems. I also happen to think InfoSec is a complex system. It's plagued by an inability to predict attacker actions and frankly, oftentimes defender actions too. Has highly interconnected dynamic relationships. There are attackers and defenders, but then there are other people in the ecosystem, like governments, software vendors, software providers, and so forth. So I think to attempt to unfurl all these relationships is really prohibitive, and you can't do that in a complex system. So the first application of resilience through the lens of these complex systems was by C.S. Halling, who was one of the founders of ecological economics, and this was in 1973. So basically the amount of change that could be absorbed before the underlying structure of the system changed. So ecological systems can be highly resilient, but also exhibit a high level of fluctuation each time. So a good example of this is chestnut trees, actually. So believe it or not, in North America, forests were once full of chestnut trees, but there was a chestnut blight in the first half of the 20th century that completely wiped them out. But the forest didn't disappear. It was that oak and hickory trees sprung up in their stead. So basically it continued to adapt even though it had the same underlying structure. Evolutionary resilience is kind of beyond the C.S. Halling interpretation in 1973. Again, it assumes that there are socio-ecological systems that are co-evolutionary. So the idea is it's not just about adapting, it's also about transforming. So it completely rejects the idea that you should bounce back to whatever you thought your normal was. It's that there is no real normal, and you have to be able to kind of like go between these sorts of equilibriums. You should also have multiple level controls, and also the ability to kind of like reorganize around whatever your reality is, and also being able to understand and question the assumptions about what your reality is. As an example, communities can diversify their agricultural landscapes and production systems in response to climate change or other sorts of changes. So you can designate some areas for like soil conservation, multi-cropping, organic agriculture. You can protect some forested areas as like preservation, but then use other parts for whatever the needs of the town are. This leads us to what are the core characteristics. As I mentioned before, it's robustness, adaptability, and transformability. You have to be able to withstand a shock, adjust so as to incur less damage, and then also be opening to challenging your previous decisions and goals. So in InfoSec, it means robustness. You have to be able to withstand an attack. Adaptability is being able to adjust your environment so you incur less damage when attacked. Then transformability is challenging your existing assumptions around who will attack you, what sort of attack it will be, what the right strategy is. Unfortunately, in most domains, robustness was the dominant defensive strategy. It can be linked back to that idea of engineering resilience, which has really persisted for a long time. So in flood prevention, for example, barriers are a form of robustness. They block storm surges that happen during like hurricanes and other sorts of storms. Hurricane Harvey, though, if y'all are familiar, it happened in Texas. The primary source of damage was actually flooding from rain, not from the storm surge. So you have to have adaptability and transformability to incur less damage from it, and then also rethink your existing strategy and what your assumptions were. So I know this is super trite, that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. That's like an Instagram caption, but it's actually really true here. So resilience has to be framed as a continuous evolving process, but it also has to be sustainable. So Peter Timmerman, who's also an ecological economics scholar, described it as resilience as the building of buffering capacity into a system to improve its ability to cope going forward. So the idea here is if you focus just on robustness, it leads to a presentation of the problem based on reducing the risk itself. So basically it's how can we withstand the hurricane versus we know the hurricane will hit us. How do we make sure that the damage doesn't completely wipe out our community? So adaptability and transformability accept that the risk will exist, while robustness doesn't. So it stresses the need to reduce the potential damage and then restructure around the risk and around your reality. So I think a very appropriate quote is by Susan Elizabeth Howe. She's a seismologist at the USGS, and she looks into like earthquake prediction. And she said, a building doesn't care if an earthquake or shaking was predicted or not. It will withstand the shaking or it won't. So I think there's been a lot of focus in security around how do we predict breaches, and not to say that's not an important problem. It's good to understand the likelihood of it, but if you haven't designed your systems to make sure that you can withstand a breach, you're not gonna make it, even if you can predict it. So even though our industry, I think we borrowed from the military that there are lots of unknown unknowns, our strategy is kind of still based in hubris that we can save ourselves in the event of a breach with systems that can kind of withstand unknown risks at unknown times with unknown faces. But an evolutionary resilience approach accepts that all of these things will happen, that there are unknowns, and accepts that change is inevitable. So it ensures the system actually survives by changing itself, by making you kind of have your own unknown face. So that, the first characteristic is robustness. So robustness involves withstanding and resisting a negative event. As I mentioned, engineering used this concept of robustness to mean resilience. It's basically how long it takes to get back to whatever your prior equilibrium was. But if you think about it, if whatever system it was experienced some sort of negative shock, some sort of damage due to an event, the equilibrium probably wasn't very good going forward because it meant it was vulnerable to that event. So you wouldn't actually want to go back to that equilibrium because then you're just setting yourself up for failure again. This actually leads into the safe development paradox. So basically, when it's believed that a technical control will somehow eliminate the risk or prevent some sort of shock, it leads to larger potential damage. So it's a paradox because the stability that's promoted by implementing some sort of control to reduce the risk actually results in you building out more. So think about in the case of like cities, which I'll get into in a bit, like if you have a levee, it can result in you building out the city more. So because there's a false sense of security, you're basically over time increasing that risk. So ultimately, you're creating a maladaptive feedback loop. So once the structural mitigation is in place, more development happens, but then as the development becomes entrenched, you need more controls to make sure that the risk doesn't actually cause any damage going forward. As an example, there's more so in the 80s, fires started to being suppressed in forests that were fire adapted originally because they didn't want forest fires, and fuel started to build up in the form of trees or shrubs. People wanted, to have human settlements nearby. They started building out. Obviously, people like pretty lawns with trees, shrubs, everything else. So what happened, for example, in the 1990s in Florida is that these fires basically these forests had tons of fuel for the fire. They were used to being fire adapted, having regular fires to kind of cull everything. And then people were completely devastated because the fire was way worse than it used to be. I think similarly in security, implementing technical controls creates that false sense of security that leads to increased damage as well. So retroactively hardening or patching legacy systems in which vulns are frequently found, think about like with the Equifax breach, actually leads you to keep building on top of these systems, further entrenching them, which creates the need for more technical controls and leads to that maladaptive feedback loop. So basically feeling like the threat is being prevented leads you to have that false sense of security, which is not healthy. As I mentioned in flood risk management, it's actually called the levee paradox. So building a levee can lead to a sense of the problem being prevented, supporting further development and construction on the risky floodplain. And what's interesting is less than 3% of people in Illinois, for example, in areas with levees, actually have flood insurance. So again, it's a false sense of security, so they're kind of completely screwed if the levee doesn't work and a flood actually happens. So it lowers people's awareness of the risk and the ability to respond appropriately to it. So when implementing a robustness control, it's absolutely essential to ensure it's not encouraging further development that could be harmful and basically accumulating risk over time that becomes cataclysmic. So don't just focus on resistance in your controls. Really, if you're doing that, you're treating the symptoms of bad planning with structures, and that won't actually fix anything. I also think there's a lesson here for cyber insurance. If you think back to the flood insurance example where people are totally unprepared, insurance companies don't actually categorize those floodplains that have levees necessarily as floodplains themselves. So it means that homes or offices in those areas that become flooded don't have like related insurance requirements, which means they don't have the proper building codes and so forth. So firms offering cyber insurance should consider really carefully what they're saying will exempt companies from having some sort of insurance or additional insurance. Related to the safe development paradox is the idea that preventing a system from negative exposure over time, trying to silo it off, means that the system will only be able to function in that artificially stable state. Basically, it'll only be able to function if it's siloed off. So in the levee paradox, it creates an artificially stable system which can only survive when there are dry conditions. Another example kind of from the wilderness again is with coral reefs. So marine reserves are created to protect coral and make sure that they aren't exposed to the effects of climate change like ocean acidification and thermally induced coral bleaching. But unprotected coral actually proves much more resilient to climate disturbance because they face ongoing degradation due to other factors, and they actually start to mix with more disturbance-tolerant species. So what we think we're trying to protect, we're actually setting up for failure. So in InfoSec, you have to likewise expose your systems to external stressors. So even if you're building something that you think will only ever be internally facing, like internal only APIs, you should design them with a threat model in mind that is still externally facing. So like making sure you have data sanitization, even if it's internal only. So basically always test your systems as if they were externally facing and making sure that they're resilient to kind of these global threats. The overwhelming focus to date on InfoSec, as I mentioned, I think has been on how to stop, thwart, block attacks, really how to prevent them from happening in the first place and bouncing back to normal. So traditional components of security, if you think about firewalls, antivirus, system hardening, are all components of this robustness strategy. And the other problem is that even with remediation, the goal is to return back to normal. But as we saw with Equifax, Like when you have immutable data, there's no such thing as returning to business as usual. It just won't happen. So pen tests tend to focus just on vulnerabilities and what's needed to fix them, rather than proposing new technologies or new architectures that would make sure that your system isn't vulnerable in the next instance. Other domains held this sort of strategy as well, and it worked out really poorly for them. So engineering-led approaches tended to try to defy nature rather than trying to work around nature. So the single equilibrium in flood risk management is to have dry conditions in floodplains so that people can continue living in them. Dikes, storm surge barriers, dams were all attempts to withstand a flood and keep them from happening, and they reflect engineering resilience approaches. But the goal is to keep the same artificial equilibrium in spite of the water system's natural behavior, and it hasn't worked out very well. So I think the engineering-only focus has led to the current situation where companies' basically survival rests on them keeping up to date with patches, which is really hard to do. The model that has to be embraced is one in which even if a system is like not patched, it can still survive, that all your data isn't out in the open. So even if users click on pdf.zip.exe, your systems are okay. As we saw with Coral, if there isn't some sort of palpable risk and you aren't testing against that risk, resilience is very unlikely to actually be developed. So you have to assume that attackers will gain access to your system and then develop around that. But I don't want to say that robustness isn't important, because it is one of the key characteristics of resilience. So you have to have layered approaches. So drawing again from flood risk management, there have to be layer of controls and diversity of solutions. Again, storm surge barriers, dikes, dams, early warning systems, and so forth. You have to have multiple controls. A good example is New York City, where I live, has published guidelines for climate change resiliency and recommend a combination of controls. So for example, the excess heat that's likely to come about from climate change, they recommend having backup generators to hybrid power systems, using systems with higher heat tolerance, passive cooling and ventilation with window shades or high performance glazing, like not just one thing, like set it and forget it. You have to do multiple things. Diversity of controls also helps provide redundancy in uncertain conditions. So when complementing measures are in place, it's less likely that there will be catastrophic damage if a single control fails. The trade-off here is between efficiency and effectiveness, obviously. So the easy route is having lower upfront costs to implement a single control. But if you want effectiveness, it will take layered controls, which will be longer term and potentially higher cost, but it'll pay dividends over the course of the system's life cycle. I don't think this is a new concept for many of you. Like you can deploy the APT Blinky box on your network. It purports to stop all attacks. I think we all know in here it doesn't. So what happens if an attacker has legitimate credentials to like a cloud-based service? It's not really gonna help you in that case. Or as we saw with Kaspersky, the APT Blinky box can actually be used by the APT itself to get into your network. I think diversity can also be seen through the lens of systems, so I'm not the first to suggest this idea. Dan Geer got fired for it back in 2003 at Stake, talking about the hegemony of Microsoft as far as systems dominance. So we think of fragmentation normally as poor to have from a management perspective, but there is an argument in its favor, which basically shared hosting provides correlated risk, and we can't forget that because the financial crisis was caused by this as well. Everyone ignored correlated risk. So if there's a breach at one provider, a vulnerability in a common shared library, it's gonna create like much greater risk exposure than there would be otherwise. So you have to consider whether fragmentation is actually worth it. So there is a pitfall, which is of efficiency, which is that it creates a limited kind of area of operation in which your systems can survive. Basically, when you're only able to function within kind of your nice, beautiful garden, it's not gonna work otherwise. But if you introduce fragmentation and you kind of have messy diversity of systems, you're kind of hardening the system over time because you can adapt better to uncertainty that arises out of the fragmentation. But it is up for debate whether you want the manageability or you want the minimized impact via diversity. Asset management is hard enough as it is. If you have lots of diversity and fragmentation, obviously that's gonna make it much harder. So that's, I think, something that I would love to talk about on an industry level. But thinking in decision trees can also make sure that you have this proper diversity of controls. So I've discussed decision trees in prior talks, like at Black Hat. All my slides are always online, so you can check them out. But the goal should be to walk through the steps an attacker would take in order to get to whatever their goal is, but importantly, it's also thinking about what mitigations they'll come across. Like very simply, if you have two-factor, you have to think about, okay, the attacker encounters two-factor, what do they do next? You can start to see how you need to layer and complement your controls in that vein. So raising the cost to the attacker serves to me as a bridge between robustness and adaptability. There are a few quotes which I reuse constantly, and one is by Dino Dizovi, which is attackers will take the least cost path through their attack graph from their start node to their goal node. So if you can raise the cost to the attacker, you can start deterring attackers, and kind of that notion of how can we prevent the attack from happening at all. But it does mean attackers will need greater resources and a greater level of sophistication to do so, which is what you want. One way to raise costs is through diversified controls, but another way is through adaptability. So adaptability is about reducing the cost of damage incurred and keeping your options open to support eventual transformability. The evolutionary approach I mentioned, where systems are co-evolving, is one in which the assumptions are that conditions will change constantly and adapt over time. So the system itself has to incur this long-term change, and reversion to that pre-existing state isn't actually desirable. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually highlights the need for realism and warns about the dangers of incremental change versus adaptation, and that a lot of people call adaptation, or what they call adaptation is actually just incremental changes. So they specifically recommend questioning underlying assumptions and existing structures. You have to acknowledge the inevitability of this macro level change, and then you make managed transformation the goal rather than anything else. So it creates a false sense of security if you're just kind of undergoing these incremental changes without really questioning your assumptions about the reality, and it's part of the safe development paradox in my view. So you can alleviate symptoms in the short term, but you're not really preparing yourself for success long term. A good example that's on a macro level related to climate change is actually with animals. So traditional protection strategies for wildlife at risk is to keep them, if you think about the pandas, it's like siphon off some area where they can enjoy bamboo, whatever else. So it's preserving existing habitats. The problem is they're in static locations and they become increasingly isolated, and actually creates genetic ghettos that set up those animals for failure if they ever have to leave those areas. But if you look at what wildlife naturally does and has done over time in prior climate change events, they actually track their ideal location. So they'll migrate, like for example, up the mountain to whatever is preferable for them. So recommendations that you now see for climate change and preserving wildlife now include the idea that, for example, if ideal conditions are, let's say, across from a city, you create whatever their current situation is, you create like a very narrow land bridge where they can pass through and get to that ideal location. I like to think of legacy systems like these preserved habitats. We're preserving them through patching and retroactive hardening. But again, the adaptive model from nature is that we need to actually migrate to new territories and new systems. So to me, it's similar in effect to moving to a different mode of operation or new infrastructure. As a tangible example, an organization's status code might be that they use inline PHP code within the HTML of their web apps to perform database queries. So if an injection vuln is found in one instance of the PHP code, they'll patch that. They won't really do a review of all of their systems. So they're improving robustness by patching that code, and they're returning to the stable equilibrium, but they're not really solving the problem. Embracing adaptability would say, okay, instead of using inline PHP code, let's create a single class for database queries. It also helps if you have lots of developer turnover. They're not going to be totally confused trying to hunt down all of the instances of inline PHP code. Preservation can also lead to misleading indicators of resilience. So for example, with coral again, there are static measurements like high coral cover or fish abundance. They're actually poor indicators because they're lagging indicators. So they're just measurements of what used to be favorable conditions and don't reflect the current reality. So what you want to do is ensure that your threat models aren't based on favorable past conditions. So organizations using a library with no known vulns may treat their security model as complete. They don't have to do extra work or perform continuous reviews, but they should. The issue is that attacker methods or vulnerabilities aren't always well publicized. A lot of times they're kept private. So you have to frequently review your security posture, assuming that there will be vulns found, that eventually something will come out. So as a recent example, probably some of you had to update your threat models and systems based on Eternal Blue coming out. It's not like when it came out, suddenly it was starting to be used. It had been used years and years before, you just weren't aware of it. In the climate change realm, moving members of a species that are used to warm areas to intermingle with its kind that live in colder areas actually helps improve the adaptability of the herd. I think likewise, apps built on legacy systems and libraries which have never been exposed to the outside world, which suddenly need exposure to external APIs, tend to fare extremely poorly in security terms. You may have worked on projects that kind of fell apart once you expose them to the outside world. So similarly, in the unprotected coral example, the lack of the system's exposure to the threat has weakened its ability to adapt and survive the threat. So you should intermingle your internally facing systems with your externally facing systems to ensure they meet kind of these global standards. Again, your pen tests have to be kind of assuming that at some point they will be externally facing. Another example is the goal for cities in the face of natural disasters is to maintain a flexible approach in order to properly adapt their response to lots of different kinds of risks that change over time. So cities have to cultivate, and it's recommended guidance, and certainty and surprise into their approach. Otherwise, they're being completely unrealistic about the kind of ecosystem they're in. Similarly, I think you have to test attacker playbooks against yourself to determine how quickly you can actually adapt to attacker methods. So probably a lot of you wish you had in-house red teams. Some of you may. If you do have them, have your red teams map out the decision trees that they use when they're conducting their assessment. Also map out all the different ways that they actually didn't succeed, and just make sure that you're doing that over time to see like how you're adapting to as they evolve their own methods over time. For those of you who don't have red teams, it's obviously unrealistic to hire them that often. At least once a year is still useful. There's starting to be tools coming out that are doing automatic playbook testing, which could be useful going forward. But another idea is if you're familiar with Netflix's Chaos Monkey, you have to be able to test your ability to absorb the impact of an attack and minimize the damage. So one such test is failure injection. So Chaos Monkey is part of Netflix's suite of tools called the Simian Army. So it kills instances in order to test their ability to survive some sort of like widespread outage. It's actually described as a resiliency tool, so it's kind of perfect. It was designed with a performance use case in mind, but I actually think it can be used really well for security because it makes persistence really hard. If you're constantly killing instances at random, attackers aren't gonna know like when or where or like how long they're gonna have. Of course, very good attackers are gonna be able to conduct their operations, learn very quickly, but for a lot of attackers, it's probably going to be prohibitive. The idea with Chaos Monkey for Netflix is to design a cloud architecture which even if a single component fails, kind of the whole system survives. So similarly, you need to design a security architecture, again, where if one component fails, your system doesn't have a complete meltdown. I understand that rethinking security architecture is hard. You don't have enough people. You don't necessarily have enough budget. I do think a lot of times people think about organizational pressures as the main hindrance to being able to adapt in InfoSec, but I actually think the complexity and certainty from that fragmentation of tools that I mentioned is frankly the #1 source of being overwhelmed, because it's like, where do you even start in architecting some sort of new security strategy? But I think one way to do that is actually switching to new infrastructure. So I don't know how many of you use containers, but deploying Chaos Monkey is one example, containers is another. It really helps with transformability, which is what I'll be talking about next. But I think they're a natural fit kind of for evolutionary resilience because they promote adaptability and support transformability. I don't pretend to be a container expert. If you want to learn more about containers, at JessFraz is her Twitter. That's a link to a ton of talks that are really helpful. But I think she highlighted in her recent talk at DevOps Days that containers actually represent an opportunity, kind of like a salvation from the trade-off you normally have between security and usability. As per Microsoft, containers are a way to wrap up an application, kind of its own pretty neat box. They're an isolated resource control and a portable runtime environment. So basically serves as a layer of extraction between the application and its host server, and it can be like virtualized or bare metal. And so it allows for easier migration, so even if the underlying infrastructure changes, you can still have your applications and you don't have to rebuild them every time. So it really bolsters flexibility and flattens complexity a lot. So it makes it a lot easier to figure out what's going wrong. The legacy approach makes figuring out root cause really, really difficult. But you have, with containers, verifiably working systems. You understand kind of like all the dependencies, so it makes remediation a lot less messy. Also, it allows for better transportation to infrastructure. You can actually manage, again, dependencies and licenses a lot more easily. And then it's also easier to kill the infection and stop the spread. So similar to Chaos Monkey, you can just kind of like wipe out a container and rebuild it if it becomes infected. You have to ensure adaptability to manage resilience erosion as well. So in the case of coral, there are these pulse type stressors. So you can think about those as acute kind of short-term stressors. So it's like tropical cyclones, coral bleaching, destructive fishing, but then there are press type stressors, which are long-term. So that's pollution, sedimentation, overfishing, ocean warming, acidification. So it really causes, when the long-term stressors occur a lot, it causes the resilience to the acute stressors to really go down. So basically, the more complexity you have in your own systems, that's going to be a press type stressor, that long-term stressor. It's going to reduce your ability to withstand the short-term impacts like a data breach. So as you add complexity to your apps and systems, it becomes more difficult to test every possible path attackers could get into, and it begins trending, frankly, towards infinity, which no one wants to have to deal with. So you've basically eroded your resilience if you can't test your vulnerability any longer. So you won't have adaptability or transformability. The final piece is transformability. So you want to challenge your existing assumptions and reorganize your system around the nature of your reality. So back to the prior example of the horrible inline PHP code, it makes it really hard to reorganize your system around reality versus single class because it's very hard to migrate it over time. As your company's environment changes, you're basically going to have to wrestle with that all the time. Your engineers are going to be really mad because they have all this technical debt. No one's going to be happy. Research from other domains has explored the policy implications of transformability and also how to implement it on a practical level. So in disaster recovery, particularly urban areas, has been really well researched in this vein. So again, thinking about floods, what makes more sense in the event of a hurricane or something else is actually moving systems out of the way, ideally rebuilding the urban area in a way that doesn't directly expose it to the threat, even if it's low probability. So the policy should be to change location, not keep adding those structural controls. So as a tangible example of this, if you've been to New Zealand, Christchurch was really devastated by an earthquake in 2011. The cost to rebuild has been put at $40 billion, which is huge. It was the second most populous city at the time of the earthquake. It's now the third most populous. It was that much of a hit. It killed 185 people and destroyed over 100,000 houses, so it was a massive wipeout. What New Zealand did is they didn't let people just rebuild in the same area for obvious reasons, or what should be obvious from the talk, but they designated a red zone where rebuilding was neither safe nor economical. So basically they conducted an assessment to figure that out. They offered money to the citizens who had houses there in order to relocate. So the assessment really embraces this transformability. It questions the assumptions about should houses actually be on like a fault line and says that you should do something else instead. You should identify the red zones within your own IT systems. So which technologies or sort of infrastructure strategies present the highest level of risk and are going to be really hard to actually fix vulnerabilities and won't have that sort of level of resilience. Maintenance costs can also be thought of this. Like I said, complexity will reduce your resiliency over time. So what are your red zones that are contributing to that complexity? So systems, I think systems that are directly exposed internally or entirely public facing should be obvious ones where they need extra love and attention. Exposing critical functionality, anything having personally identifiable information, legacy systems with outdated libraries, systems with no backups that aren't easily restored. All of those you should really think about, like, do you want to move it to better infrastructure? Like, how can you make sure to protect it and question your assumptions around why are you using those systems? Why are you operating them in that way? So I don't think defining red zones really should be focused on vulnerabilities. I think it needs to be thinking about the path to actually compromising systems. So for an example, an API consuming critical data should be in a red zone whether it has vulnerabilities or not, because it's consuming critical data. You have to assume, again, that it will be attacked, and you have to build your assumptions around that model. So you want to identify the assets that fall under your red zone criteria and migrate them to a safer system. So locking down public exposure so that it's only accessible via your corporate VPN, rebuilding the asset using newer infrastructure technologies like containers, proxying encrypted data further into the architecture's core, security logging and monitoring, locking down privileged access, kind of the basics in that way. So by implementing all or at least some of those solutions, the system won't be in a red zone any longer. So it's similar, you can think about moving a power plant out of the floodplain and building it like on a cliff and adding like early warning systems. So using again the example of levees, researchers have proposed an idea that you actually have planned decommission of levees over time, because it would be really unfair to ask people to move away overnight because this is a floodplain and we're doing this new strategy. People would probably get up in arms. So you have these planned decommissions. The idea is that levees can be then a stopgap before you actually transform. So I think the idea is that you want to continually consider how you can prepare in advance for migration. So maybe you have planned decommission of legacy systems. You make sure that as you're building out new applications, they're on new infrastructures that you're able to transition them over. I think instead of just continually retroactively hardening and patching your systems, again, be starting to migrate, have an end date for when you'll stop patching and everything. So it also ensures that you aren't renewing software or hardware that you don't think actually bolsters your security posture, and like you're always checking those assumptions about what's working and what's not. I also think collaboration is really, really important in this. A lot of, as you probably picked up, what I've talked about requires kind of this cross-organizational collaboration. So rather than relying on like inferred knowledge towards a predefined goal, you should be upfront about like, here are the risks, here's what we're accepting as far as the risks, here's where the risks aren't covering what we're doing, which I know sometimes as security professionals makes us uncomfortable because we want to be able to say, yeah, we've got it, we're doing a great job. It's much more beneficial to the organization to be resilient, to say, listen, we're doing a great job to cover these sorts of risks, but listen, the controls we have are still leaving us exposed to X, Y, Z. Otherwise, it's really difficult for communities to figure out how they can help and what they need to do to prepare. So I think you should have open sharing, kind of the protections in place, what risk remains, and uncertainties in the approach as well, to try to foster collaboration. Particularly engineers, like I don't know about y'all's experience, but I think engineers a lot of times find security really fascinating. So bring them in and start telling them about this, and maybe they're using something like containers or something else where they think it could mitigate some of the risk. I think containers are an interesting example because they benefit so much from something like containers, and security can as well. It improves adaptability for both groups, so everyone really benefits. I think the trend towards flexibility is maybe one of the strongest in engineering today, and it also obviously supports what I'm talking about for security. There's a book that came out recently by O'Reilly called Agile Application Security, if you want to read more about this idea of partnering with engineering on these sorts of projects. Really, in this collaborative model, your role is to manage what I call state transitions. So you want to help people, migrate away from the floodplain area where they don't have insurance to the safer area. I don't think you can remove the need to create or implement solutions to some extent. You're still going to have to do a lot of the work, but also think about kind of offloading and outsourcing some of the work onto the rest of the organization. Again, like with the engineering group, they'll probably conduct the work to migrate to containers. You don't have to do that, but it requires you sitting down with them and thinking through it. A good example is John Flynn at Facebook gave a great talk a few years ago about implementing two-factor authentication at Facebook. So the goal was to put 2FA on SSH to make it hard for attackers to pivot into Facebook's production environment. As you can imagine, he had to think very carefully about UX because SSH, you don't really want to add any friction to that process. So they decided to use Duo Security and a YubiKey Nano. So if you're not familiar with YubiKeys, you just have to touch basically a dongle on the side of your laptop in order to authenticate. And then Duo's cloud-based token ensured that there was backup access in case an engineer lost their YubiKey. The key discovery for them during this project was you can actually implement, this is a direct quote, you can actually implement security controls that affect every single thing people are doing and still make them love it in the process. It works so well that they decided to put it onto their email and to their VPN too, but it required them really reaching out and speaking across the organization. Even though I recognize software is eating the world, every company is sort of becoming a tech company. Most companies now have dev teams in-house or engineering teams in-house. That's not true for everyone. Sometimes you have a limited IT group. It doesn't mean you can't collaborate. You probably have a general counsel or some other risk person or even sales, frankly. There are ways that you can leverage how to make their jobs easier and how to make their jobs better that'll still promote flexibility for you. For this sort of transformability to happen, you need really responsive governance systems, obviously. So you have to implement decision-making processes that are really respondent to emerging threats. You have to ensure that your organization is learning from prior experiences, so you have to be able to update your models after a breach. Think again about those sort of decision tree processes. Your entire organization's community has to be prepared. So again, it goes back to the transparency around sharing information. You have to, as an organization, be open to continually challenging the assumptions around your strategy in security. I think implementing a security culture and having fun with it in your organization is perhaps the best chance of doing so. Like Kelly Lum, or Loria, as she's known better, talked yesterday, like they have an actual, their security team has an actual candy budget at Flatiron Health to encourage people to come by and just talk, and also talk about like what are their challenges, how to make it work better for them. Instead of like being adversarial, it's really like reaching out and making sure that there's some way that you can make their lives easier, and in turn they can make your life easier too. So to wrap it up, I think this is my very, very humble attempt at a definition. I hope it's refined over time. But I think resilience and security means a flexible system that can absorb an attack and reorganize around the threat. So the system in this case is likely your organization, but I think it applies at a more micro level as well. So it's not about the ability to just withstand or prevent an attack. That's the blue pill. The red pill is that attacks will happen to you. That's just the reality, but you have to architect your security with that assumption. So I'd like to think that I've shown you kind of how far the rabbit hole goes with all of this, and that robustness, adaptability, and transformability, and all three in concert, are the only way to kind of like survive. Robustness, again, is optimized through diversity of controls, the healthy fragmentation. Adaptability minimizes the impact of an attack and also keeps your options open, for example, through new types of infrastructure such as containers. Then transformability demands that you challenge your assumptions and reorganize around the reality. So it's a reality that affects communities and that requires a collaborative effort. So Ian Malcolm, if you're familiar with Jurassic Park, he was my favorite character growing up, sorry. And I think it's actually a very applicable quote for how you should think about strategy. So the history of evolution is that life escapes all barriers, life breaks free. Life expands to new territories, painfully, perhaps even dangerously, but life finds a way. So I think a lot of times we think of security as in this kind of like silo and very neat box where you can only perform certain functions. But I think you should think about how can you break free. It'll probably be a little painful for your organization, but your job is to manage those transitions and make them as painless as possible. So much like with life, as per Malcolm's quote, you have to think about the survival of your organization's data at stake and really think along the lines of this model. So I do think that there's hope. Attacks evolve, but we can evolve too. Like we don't have to, it's funny, when I was doing research for this, I just in Google, did my search for before 2003. They're talking about the same things. They're literally articles about going to conferences, tons of fragmented solutions that always talk about stopping the threat and blah, blah, blah. It hasn't changed much, so we do need to change because that's the nature of our reality. So I think we have to accept our grief and architect an effective and realistic defense. We can't just keep languishing in anger and bargaining and denial. So I think the blue pill, as I put it, relegates us to the role of a firefighting cat who's drunk on snake oil. So the belief that this sort of artificial equilibrium of, yeah, we can stop attacks, is what supports the fragmentation of solutions. The absurd claims of like stopping all ODA exploits and then constant firefighting. So it feels like the cat and mouse game is more like a cruel joke, which I think all of us would like to move on from that. So I say instead of accepting snake oil, take the red pill of resilience instead. I think it will encourage us to have the right incentives to actually improve our strategies going forward. And I'd like to close with this quote for a reminder for all of us. Goes back, again, Colin talked about the security nihilism of, oh, well, attackers can still get around it, whatever. That's not how you think about it. It's good enough is good enough. Good enough beats perfect. That's life. Very little is perfect in life, so you need to operate that way as well. With that, thank you.